Unfortunately, this was not meant to be. On the positive side, one advantage of the virtual meeting is that it's much more inclusive. And many of you who might not have been able to come to Chicago are able to connect to our events virtually. You will also be able to watch many sessions later at your convenience. To answer a question many of you may have, this session, the presidential address, is recorded, and we're going to post it on the Econometric Society website in a few days. Before I go on, I would like to thank all those who have made this meeting possible. There are too many people to thank, but let me acknowledge 4 of them. The first one is Stefan Bonhomme, the chair of the program chair of the North American Winter Meeting. Enrique Santana, the executive vice president of the Econometric Society, and Lynn Hogan, the managing director, provided invaluable help. Gwen Loftis, the convention manager of the American Economic Association, helped us coordinate events across the 2 societies. And last but not least, I would also like to thank Orazio, the current president, the outgoing president, who last year had to deal with the organization of the World Congress. The World Congress, as you may know, it's not just one meeting, it's perhaps the largest meeting in economics. And we had to do this virtually for the very first time. I think it's fair to say that despite some hiccups, that meeting was a success, and it has led to wide support for hybrid meetings in the future. So thank you, Orazio, and also the other organizers for making my life this year much easier. This is only one of the many contributions Orazio has made to the Econometric Society and to the profession in general. So it's my great pleasure to introduce him now, although I think it's fair to say that Orazio really does not need introduction. Orazio Attanasio is currently the Coles Professor of Economics at Yale University. He obtained his undergraduate degree from the University of Bologna in Italy and his PhD at the London School of Economics. After finishing his PhD, he came to the United States, to Stanford, where he spent several years. Then he returned to Europe, first to the University of Bologna, and then to University College London, where eventually he became the Jeremy Bentham Research Professor of Economics. Orazio stayed at UCL until last year when he moved to Yale. He has also been a longtime fellow of the Institute of Fiscal Studies, the so-called IFS in London, and he's still co-director of the Center for the Evaluation of Development Policies at the IFS. Orazio has had a distinguished career in academics, and the few minutes that I have are certainly not enough to summarize his many contributions and his many distinctions. Let me just highlight a few among his many distinctions. He's currently elected fellow of the British Academy. He has previously served as president of the European Economic Association. He's also a member of the Council of the Royal Economic Society and also a member of the Executive Committee of the Latin American Economic Association. He also serves as member of several policy boards. He has also held several editorial appointments. So among other things, he has served as editor of Quantitative Economics, as managing editor of the Review of Economic Studies, as editor of the Journal of the European Economic Association, and also as founding editor of Microeconomic Insights. Orazio's research is remarkable in at least 2 respects. The first is its breadth. So I think it's fair to say that Orazio has worked on many topics and in many areas, and in fact, it would be impossible to put him in a particular field box. His work bridges micro and macro, and as well as theory and empirics. The second aspect in which that's really remarkable about Orazio's work is that even though it has a heavy empirical component and it uses a lot of data, it's always grounded in theory, and there is always a very clear connection between the model specification and the empirical specification. Early on, one would associate Orazio's name with work on household consumption and savings. He was among the first to use microdata to address questions that were traditionally in the domain of macro. And I think it's fair to say that he was among the first, if not the first one, to use the consumer expenditure survey to bring the life cycle model of consumption to the data. In doing so, Orazio could benefited from his experience in dealing with a family expenditure survey in Britain. And I think this should serve as a reminder to all of us how important cross-border fertilization is in academia. By now, many people use the consumer expenditure survey. It's a standard data set. But at the time when Orazio first came to America, very few even knew of this data set. His work from that time was highly influential. What's really important is that it showed, among other things, that using good data makes a difference, that having used this high quality microdata enabled Orazio and many others to show that the predictions of theory were actually supported by the data, in contrast to earlier work that had relied on aggregate data and often rejected many of the hypotheses associated with the life cycle model of consumption. Later, Orazio extended this work to also incorporate risk aversion and also to look at labor supply. This early work was focused mostly on the US and Britain, but gradually Orazio's work moved towards developing countries. And with that, he also gradually moved towards topics that are particularly relevant to development. And actually, I even have a paper with Orazio, a joint paper in international economics on the effects of the trade liberalization in Colombia. But I think this, his foray into international economics was a one-off. Most of his work that's related to development has been on the accumulation of human capital and also on early childhood interventions. And as with his earlier work, this research area has had always a very strong policy focus. So Orazio has carried out, among other things, evaluations of education access and financing programs, and also evaluations of large-scale conditional transfer programs. He has also investigated the impact of scholarships on school enrollment, and also the effect of subjective expectations on returns to education. To carry out all this work, he often spearheaded his own surveys to collect the data that were needed to answer the questions at hand. And in doing so, he encountered many of the measurement challenges that are the topic of his presidential address. So we're going to hear about all these measurement issues in a moment. I just want to say that overall this research agenda has been highly influential, and it was rightly recognized through two major recent prizes. The 2016 Klaus Jacobs Research Foundation Prize. This is a prize granted by the Jacobs Foundation for exceptional achievements in research and practice in the field of child and youth development. So that's the first prize. The second prize is the Carlos Diaz Alejandro Lacea Prize that recognizes high quality research on economic issues relevant to Latin America. So let me conclude by pointing out that Orazio epitomizes all the qualities of the econometric society, all the values of the econometric society. His research has always been driven by important questions. It's always grounded in theory. It uses the best data available, often the result of his own data collection efforts, and state-of-the-art empirical methodology to provide important insights. In addition, Orazio has been a valuable mentor to many people in our profession, including myself. He has continuously provided important professional service through his various editorial and leadership positions. And he has also managed to successfully bridge academia and policy. So it's not only my great pleasure, but also it's a true honor to introduce him to you. And with that, without further ado, let me turn it over to him now.
Thank you, Penny, for your very nice words. You did mention that you were one of my first students, so it's great to be here and be introduced by you. So it's great to be here. Let me try to share the screen. I guess you can see that. So today, I'm going to talk about economics and measurement, just as Penny was saying. I should say that this work, the work I'll be talking about, has been part of my research agenda, which has involved lots of co-authors and other people that I list there. I also received some very useful and important comments on this presentation from several colleagues and friends from different places. Finally, I should mention that, as Penny mentioned, lots of the work here has involved the collection of primary data sources, which is not a cheap enterprise. So has been financed by a variety of institutes and foundations and the like that are listed on my third bullet point. And finally, I could not have done this without the stimulating research environments that I was very lucky to be part of. The IFS in London, FAIR in Bergen in Norway, UCL, of course, and most recently here. So let me talk. This is the scheme of my talk, and what I'm going to talk is going to be about measurement. So for many years, most economists thought that the only thing that we could measure reliably was a very limited set of things. So economists thought that we could measure what people buy or do, possibly their income, their resources, the resources available to them, and prices. And with a bit of luck and lots of assumptions from these measures, we could possibly infer preferences and other structural parameters or features that the markets in which economic agents operate. However, identification of these structural parameters could only be achieved with very strong assumptions on tastes, on beliefs that people hold, on subjective expectations that people have, and the information on the basis of which economic agents operate. And these strong assumptions, and the emphasis here is in strong, were needed because things like preferences and attitudes, beliefs, and subjective expectations were largely perceived as unmeasurable. There was quite a bit of skepticism towards questions that pose hypothetical situations to respondents, and on evidence that came from stated rather than actual choices. There were good reasons for relying on a revealed preferences approach. Measuring hypotheticals and preferences and attitudes is fraught with many difficulties. I should say here there is a quote of a couple of papers by Jerry Hausman, and I do have a number of quotes in a very limited number of quotes and citations in the presentation. However, there are many more citations. I have some. They are at the end of my slides, which will be publicly available, and they will be more extensive in the written version of this work. So, for instance, there was a debate about the use of contingent evaluation. Jerry Hausman wrote 2 papers in the Journal of Economics Perspective in '94 and in 2012, and the title of those papers went from being dubious about contingent evaluation to considering as hopeless. There was the issue of what are we measuring and what are we modeling? There is a very interesting paper by Becker and Stiglitz back in 1977 in the AER entitled the Gustibus Nues Disputandum. And there's an interesting site in which they say taste neither change capriciously nor differ importantly between people. One does not argue over taste for the same reason that one does not argue over the Rocky Mountains. Both are there, will be there next year too, and are the same to all men. So there were, even back in the 50s, there were some lively discussions about this. There was an interesting exchange between Jim Tobin and George Katona on buying intentions. George Katona was in Michigan and was running surveys. And Tobin was in surveys in which respondents were posed questions about their intentions to buy in the future. Some researchers at the time tried out alternative measures to reveal preferences. Tom Juster was one. He was running some interesting work on buying intentions and purchase probabilities. He had an interesting survey on hypothetical car loans to estimate the elasticity to maturity and interest rate. Katona's work on the Michigan survey of consumer sentiment was quite influential and is still survives in its use today. However, and this discussion went on for a while. There is a nice site here from a paper by Bloch and Marshak on random utility models, in which they state that one might even admit as observable the subjective verbal statement of the relative intensity of respondents' preferences. All this is related to stated preferences and conjoint analysis, and here are some other papers. And another paper that I'd like to cite, and I reported, is another presidential address to the Econometric Society in 1958, so quite a few years back. And Havermore, who was the president at the time, in this talk, in the presidential address, this is taken from that. He was saying that it would be very useful to have measures of what people think prices or incomes will be in the future, or variables expressing what people think of the effects of their actions are going to be. And he thinks that the burden of this work is actually on theorists. Is the last two sentences of this quote. It is my belief that if we can develop more explicit and a priori convincing economic models in terms of these variables, which are realities in the minds of people, even if they're not in current statistical yearbooks, then ways and means can and will eventually be found to obtain actual measurements of such data. And it's very interesting because he identifies, and this is going to be a theme of my lecture, he identifies the measurements coming and being formed and shaped by economic models. However, having said all this, the consensus went towards an almost exclusive revealed preferences approach to measurement and its use in economics. With some exceptions. One exception was in experimental economics. Experimental economists have been trying for a number of years now different methods to measure preferences, beliefs, and attitudes that people have. Typically, this work started in the lab and was framed as being divorced from reality. More recently, experiments have been brought to the field and collected together with observational data to measure preference for and attitudes towards redistribution. There are some recent and very nice papers. As I said, they're all referenced here in the end. I will not go there in the interest of time, but those are very interesting papers. The bargaining and social preferences, reciprocity in conflict areas, willingness to compete. Things have been changing, and so now several studies now use stated preferences to model consumption behavior. And some recent innovations go beyond using stated in addition, and use stated preferences in addition to revealed preferences. So at the same time, researchers have been moving away from models that imply full rationality. So there is some work, really interesting work on robustness, on non-rational beliefs, on learnings. And at the same time, there has been some innovative work in terms of measurement. For instance, eliciting data on policy preferences or eliciting data on information available to individual agents. Related to that is the impressive amount of work that has been going on for the last 20 years on measuring subjective expectations, to which Chapmansky has contributed a lot. Data on subjective expectations may allow avoiding strong assumptions like rational expectations. And this data can be used to estimate a variety of models on retirement choices, education, and occupation choices. Work that has been closer to stuff that I've done is a measurement of beliefs and perceptions, or measurement of attitudes. So that's the background of my lecture. And what I'll try to do in my lecture is to cover two wide themes on the importance of measurement. The first one is what to measure. And in particular, I will focus on the relationship between theory and measurement. This is the stuff that Habermas was saying in 1958, how theory should inform and shape the way we measure things. And I will focus on going beyond standard concepts, which is even measuring standard concepts, as we'll argue, is not a trivial. The second will be explicit about the formulation of what I call what in the literature have been called measurement systems, i.e. the full recognition that measurement error is pervasive, is there, and is important, and should be recognized as such. Again, I refer back to the quote from Habermas. And so augmenting, this is important for many reasons, including the fact that augmenting the theoretical models we consider with the measurement system could be very useful to design survey strategies and to decide what and how we measure things. So that will be the background. I will then provide some example of measurement work and its use. And here I will use some of the work that I've done on child development. So I will start by sketching a simple, relatively simple and stylized model of child development and parental investment. And then I will show some very recent work we have done in Tanzania, where we collected data. This is a project that I very much like because it was motivated by measurement. And so we started trying new measures and trying to measure both child development and, importantly, some of the drivers of child development, including parental investment and the like. So let me start with my first point on measurement and theory. So the economic models we work with often use some abstract constructs that are not directly observable. The measures we collect and use are and should be driven by the theoretical framework that organizes our thinking. Now, this is nothing new. It goes back. Indeed, if one thinks of the development of national account statistics back then, the work by Keynes was very influential on the work by Richard Stone and on the formulation of national account statistics. So the way we formulate economic models is informative of what measures we collect. Same thing can be said about how we construct price indices, how those were informed by demand systems. And here aside some of the contribution. For instance, the beautiful book by Ditton and Moorbauer in 1980. So in practice, what we often have are what I like to call markers that are related to the latent factors that populate the theoretical models we use. Again, there is another nice quote. This is from R. Goldberg in his Fisher-Schultz lecture, which is published in Econometric in 1972, in which he said that by structural equation models, I refer to stochastic models in which each equation represents a causal link rather than a mere empirical association. And then it goes on to say the errors in the variables may be due to measurement error in the narrow sense, or to the fact that measurable quantities are not the same as the relevant theoretical quantities. And generally speaking, the structural parameters do not coincide with the coefficient of regressions among observable variables. So I think these quotes are important because we should be explicit about what is the focus of the theoretical model we are interested in, what is observable and what is not, given the available data. And this explicit consideration can lead us to try to attempt to measure additional relevant variables. And if we achieve that, if we measure some of the latent factors that enter these models, or some of the markers of these factors, then we can use more realistic models subject to less stringent assumptions. So what do we measure? A theoretical framework can be presented by f of theta phi equals 0, where theta is the matrix of latent variables, which are not necessarily observable. We might observe some of them directly and some others not. And the parameter vector phi is what characterizes the function f. This function f represents individual behavior and interactions. That is the relevant economic model we work with. And this functional f typically defines what are the latent factors of interest. We can introduce lots of details into this. We can introduce uncertainty, imperfect information. Some factors were not necessarily observed by the model's agents. But more generally, richer and more realistic f functions typically require richer set of factors and richer measurements to be able to be brought to data. And that brings me to the introduction of a measurement system, which I'll define m equal g of theta and epsilon. G is the function that relates this latent factor of interest, those that were populating the theoretical model, to the actual measures. And epsilon in this equation, in this system, is the measurement error, is what masks, is what makes this factor theta unobservable. And so that's what I was saying. Now, not all components of theta are or can be related to observable variables. The formulation, again, the formulation of this measurement system is nothing new. Again, some of the papers in the 70s were very similar to this. And R. Goldberg, in his paper, the paper I already cited, uses the permanent income model as an example where the permanent income is this unobservable factor, and current income and possibly consumption, given some structure, are the observable measures that can be related to this. Griliges, in another interesting paper published in 1974, discusses the relationship between earnings, schooling, and ability. Similar arguments can be done for production functions with endogenous inputs. For instance, the work of Holly and Pakes on Levison and Petrin and others can be formulated in these terms, using a measurement systems that relate and a theoretical model. The available measures define what components of F of the theoretical model can be related to data. And often there is a trade-off between richer measures and stronger and less realistic assumptions. Here are some examples. When you deal with information, you can have subjective expectation data with direct measures of individual expectations, direct measures of perceived risk, possibly learning, or you go without information about expectations data, and you are forced to assume rational expectations. And then you're forced to identify a risk from time series or cross-sectional variation, which could be legitimate, but requires a number of strong assumptions. Or you can get just a set identification, as shown in a recent paper by Chen and others in relaxing rational expectations. You can have beliefs about processes, like the production function or the investments, or you assume that the agents, the economic agents in the model, have full knowledge of the relevant processes. You can have static preferences, and then you can use this data to estimate taste for different commodities, discount factors, risk aversions, test for the distribution, altruism, or you can simply rely on reveal preferences and make some specific assumptions about the parameters, including the type of heterogeneity that you allow across agents. You know, as we'll see, you can actually combine the two approaches and use both stated and revealed preferences, but there are clear advantages that allow you to relax some of the strong assumptions in using stated preferences. I will use later on some additional example on other measures like bargaining power within couples. This is some work that I've done with Ingrid Dalmas, who is a co-author or one of the two co-authors of this work with Pan Jervis and Pedro Carneiro. And we can have information available to agents and the quality. So this is some work that I've done with Sonia Krutikova recently. So later in the lecture, I'll stress the relationship between theory and measurement, and I will use a model of child development and the accumulation of human capital and the new measures from Tanzania. Now, how do you go from theory to measures? Now, a first issue for given an economic model is what are the relevant latent factors and their dimension. In the example of human capital that we'll be using, you know, you start asking a bunch of questions like, is human capital in a production function unidimensional or multidimensional? Are unidimensional skills sufficient to characterize economic production, or do you need different skills and possibly a combination of different skills? What is the role of social-emotional skills and cognitive skills, or even physical strength? Do individuals have and use these different combinational skills, and how are these skills accumulating over the life cycle? The second question is, what do individuals in the model know? What is observable to the decision makers in the model? What knowledge do they have of the effects of their decisions? And this is especially if you're interested in investment decisions. Could be parental investment, but it could be the other sources of investment. It's an important issue because you have to say what expected returns people have, and that's going to be a function of their perception of the process and the effect of the decisions. It is impressive, you know, if you think back of the citation that I did of Avermo, again, it's and Goldberg. These are exactly the terms that they were worried about. What factors are imprecisely observable and what are intrinsically not observable? So those are important questions for our research. And the answers to these questions will depend on what kind of issues we are interested in. What are the economic variables and models that we're interested in. We then, the second step is to have to establish how to relate the relevant latent factors to the available measures. This approach is as I mentioned already a couple of times, is neither new nor exclusive to economics. Indeed, the work on in the 70s on mimic model and more generally factor models in economics and other disciplines like psychology, sociology, and genetics is very similar to this approach. And these are some of the papers back then that they looked at these issues. Which brings me to the measurement system, to the specification of the measurement system. What I will do here, I will use a specific example of a measurement system that has been used quite a bit in recent years. Was used by Cunha, Heckman, and Shenak in another econometric paper. But this was a winner of the Frisch Medal in 2010. And what this model does is relates a set of measures to some latent factors with some parameters, the alphas and the betas, and the epsilon is again the measurement system. It's very strong set of assumptions here are done, but I think it's a useful structure that we can then relax some of the assumptions that are implicit in here. So theta j is a factor j for individual I at time t. Mjk is a measure measure k for factor j. So there are several measures relating to each of the factors. And epsilon again is the measurement error. Alpha and beta are parameters representing the discriminating salience properties of each of the measures. Of course, as I said, there are lots of assumptions that are necessary to make this model operative. You need at least 2 measures, if not more, for each of the factors. And crucially, you need the measurement errors to be independent across at least 2 measures for each factor. The reason is kind of an obvious point, but the reason I want to stress this, as we'll see, is because being specific about the assumptions you need can inform the way you design your surveys and your measure. And I'll come back to this point later. Now, non-parametric identification is possible, but often what researchers do end up with specific assumptions about the distribution of the factors, of the latent factors. Now, in this specific formulation, each measure is determined by only one factor. This is what is called as a dedicated system. And this assumption can be somewhat, although not completely, relaxed. You will need some exclusion and restriction. Again, there's nothing new here. I'm simply taking from the existing literature. And I should explicitly refer to the paper by Cunha, Heckman, and Shenak. Now, the conceptual framework that one uses, the theory, must be key in informing measurement strategies. If you have enough measurements, you can possibly identify causal links. In a sense, even the recent fashion on randomized controlled trials can be interpreted as a measurement issue. You design an experiment to get some measures that can be used in a specific way to identify some parameter of interest. So to establish causal links between variables, it might be useful to collect information on drivers of a given variable, which plausibly do not affect others. Again, the RCT is a good example of that. But there might be some other factors, like prices and other environmental factors can be relevant. Past events, changes exogenous to the account of interest, but not to some of its determinants. So that's the first step of the measurement system. The second step is aggregating available measures. Again, I will come back to this issue in the applications we did in Tanzania. But I want to stress here that a good measurement system could be interpreted as an effective way to aggregate and summarize the available measures and items. As a researcher, you shouldn't choose or pick and choose from a set of measures, but you should write down the model you have in mind and then use the measurement system as an aggregator. In a way, this is analogous to the scoring algorithms that are often used in psychometrics, where a set of often binary variables are converted into a score. And often available measures use predefined scoring algorithms that are often very obsolete and were constructed maybe decades ago on obsolete samples and or are oversimplified. There is no need to use that, to use predefined scoring algorithms. Indeed, if you have the access to the individual items of a given survey or test, it's much more useful to construct your own scoring algorithms. And we will see some example of this in our work in Tanzania. And a new measurement system might allow flexibility about functional form assumptions on the distribution of the latent factors, as we'll see. Which brings me to normalization and anchoring of system. I will go quickly here because I am aware of the time ticking down, and I want to get to the last part with application. So we need to fix the metric of the unobservable factors. We need to, in the previous system, we need to normalize at least one of alpha and one of the betas per factor, or normalize the mean and variance of the theta. And this normalization defines the scale and the location of the unobservable factors. So let me skip this. This discussion will be present at length in the written version of this. Just to stress this normalization issue, the metric we choose is not innocuous, and there is some recent work that has looked at these issues. This is the point instead that I want to spend a couple of minutes on, the strategies for measurement. So as I said before, specifying precisely the measurement system and the assumptions that will be required to use the available measures can inform the way we collect data. One can design survey methods that ensure that the crucial assumptions that we need in the measurement system hold. For instance, I mentioned one thing that you always need is that measurement error is independent across different items. Now, what you can do if you're running your own survey, you can embed this in the way you collect the data. For instance, you can use different evaluators for different measures and assign the evaluators randomly to your subjects, or you can play around on the timing of data collection, so that when you go to the practice and you say, okay, these two measures are correlated, this assumption is embedded in the way you collect the data. And again, more generally, the economic model that one uses should dictate and direct what type of measures we collect and how they're collected. So these are the two main points that I wanted to make in terms of methods. That brings me to, when discussing this lecture with some of my colleagues and friends, one thing that became clear is that I do not want to preach a sermon. And in order to avoid that danger, now I want to give some specific example. So I will refer to a model of individual behavior. And this is some work that have been done recently on child development and parental investment. Child development, especially in the first few years of life, has long-run consequences for adult outcomes and economic growth. This is now well recognized, the work that Jim Heckman and others have done is been very important in this respect. So a theoretical framework that is now widely used is that of a child development, or is of child development as an outcome of a production function. These are two of the papers that formulated quite precisely what we as economists mean by that, Cunha, Heckman, and Todd and Walben, and many others. So several studies have now looked at the production function of different dimensions of human capital. I already mentioned the paper by Cunha, Heckman, and Shinak. I've done some work with Costas Magir and Emily Nix, Sarah Catana, many others and then again, there are several papers by Heckman and many others on trying to estimate this production function. Now, one of the challenges one faces is that some of the inputs on this production function are chosen by individual actors, like parents or teachers. And so that might make it difficult to identify the impacts that these inputs have on the outcomes. In the paper with Costas and others, we use a control function approach that could, and the reason I cite this particular paper, because we work with a model where you can use an IV strategy or a control function approach that could be valid regardless of the assumptions on what parents know about the process of child development. So there's lots of research that has been done on this, but there are still many open questions. One already mentioned what and how many dimensions should one consider? What is the dynamics of the process of child development? And these are important because if you want to know what policies you should advise upon, it might be important to identify what in the literature are known as windows of opportunity for interventions, which depend crucially on the dynamics of human capital accumulation. And you might want to focus on specific, especially if you want to deal with scalable interventions, we want to focus on specific dimensions of child development. Do I focus on social-emotional skills or on language in early years or other sources of cognitions and the like? And so in order to do that, better, richer, and scalable measures are necessary, especially if you work in developing countries. And again, I'll come back later to this in the Tanzania example. Second, establishing causal links between child development, parental investment, and other factors is still a big open question. And we want to know what are the main determinants and drivers of parental investment. What do parents do? Why they do it? How do we estimate the causal links between drivers and outcomes? And in order to answer this set of queries, here the blue are the questions and the red are the answers. Measures of the drivers of parental investment are necessary. So let me sketch a simple model. This is oversimplified, but is useful to define the importance of parental choices and how this can be modeled. So we start with the assumption that parents maximize an objective function, which the utility function U depends on C, which is parental consumption, children human capital, possible leisure, L. And here I allow two, we have wives and women and men, and with Pareto weights, pi and 1 minus pi. So the utility function does not need necessarily be of the unitary type. So that's one of the constraints is a budget constraint. So they have to finance consumption and parental investment X. Parental investment X here does not enter utility directly, even though it can be inserted, but it does enter the budget constraint. Q and P are vectors of prices for consumption commodities and for investment, and why are the available resources. If you make the model more complex, include dynamics, you can also include access to credit. The process of child development, that's where parental investment enters, is given by this function f, which depends some initial condition of child development, the investment x, and possibly leisure time and other time spent by the parents, and some other random shocks. Now, the parents do not necessarily know this f function, but they certainly have perceptions about the process of child development. So here I assume that parents have h is a function of some function g of the same inputs, and they do not necessarily coincide with the true process of child development. Now, you can add additional complications to this framework. There is some interesting work by Rebecca Dyson-Ross recently, where she has possible misperceptions by the parents of the initial condition. So instead of the G could be a function of H naught tilde rather than H naught. You can have several children rather than just one child. You can have preferences that reflect different types of biases that parents might have, including gender biases. But even in the simplest version of the model, if you solve out for parental investment, that will depend on budget and time constraints. If you have several time periods, you have availability of credit that could be relevant. You have expected income and its riskiness can be relevant. Then depends on parental preferences for child development, which in turn, might depend on discount factors, on risk aversion, on if you have different several children, might depend on preferences for efficiency and equity. And here I couldn't resist the temptation to cite a paper of one of my students who is on the job market this year, where he's looked at some of these issues. And that depends on number three, third bullet point is parental beliefs about the process of child development. It will not, the parental investment will not depend on F necessarily. It will depend on G, the function, what parents think about the expected return to an investment. It might be the case that parents don't invest in their, much time in their children, not because they don't like them or they don't love them, but simply because they don't think it's particularly useful. And that's a possibility. And finally, if it's to make decisions, it will be depend on who makes the decision and who has decision-making power. This is the Pareto weights in that function. Now, the parental investment and many of these drivers are not directly observable. And so measures of these latent factors may allow the identification of richer model. And so so this is the simple sketch of the model. Again, it's nothing new here, but I wanted to use this as a framework to show you some of the work we have done recently in Tanzania on measures. And as I said, this project in Tanzania was explicitly done to develop new measures. And now we are in the process of using and replicating some of them in different contexts. So we collected a new data set in rural villages in Tanzania. We have 2 rounds of data collection, interviewing around 450 households in each round. These are different households, this is not a longitudinal data set. So we started by collecting a standard set of socioeconomic questionnaires, including expenditure, income, wealth, education, demographics, and standard measures of child development and parental investment. I will be referring to the type of measures of child development we use. When I talk about children here, these are really young children. The children are sampled are aged between 6 and 42 months. And then we went out and collected a new set of measures on other factors like beliefs, bargaining power within the marriage, and stated preferences for the allocation across different commodities. We randomized who answered some of the questions. So in a third of the households is the husband on his own that answered the questionnaires. In a third of the sample is the wife on her own, and in in the third third of the sample is the couple together that they answer the question. So we have 3 independent samples. So let's start with measuring standard outcomes and drivers. As I mentioned, both child development and parental investment are complex and multidimensional construct. The use of measurement system is particularly appropriate in this context because we can, as I mentioned earlier, we can use it to aggregate efficiently existing measures. And possibly we can construct cheaper and more effective measures, which, especially if you work in developing countries, can be very important. Indeed, one of the motivation was of the Tanzania project was to improve on existing measures of child development. And there are several initiatives of this type. I'm keen to cite in particular the GSED initiative, which has been done in literally hundreds of countries around the world. Now, what we did in Tanzania, we started from a large number of items taken from a variety of different tests. And then we aggregate this with a measurement system. And this allows to construct a score in an efficient way, but also allows us to identify items that are particularly informative to the concept we are interested in. So we do latent factors on these measures. And so we can construct an alternative measure that can be obtained from a reduced number of items. So in the second wave, we collect a reduced set of items to validate the new index in the new sample. And the resulting tests are as informative, that's one of the results we obtain, as the more traditional ones, and much cheaper to implement. So this is the evidence. I don't want to just cite the results, but present some evidence for that. So one of the tests we use is what some people consider as the gold standard is the Bailey's index of child development, which is for this ages is made of 91 items. So it takes a lot of time to collect the Bailey's. On average, is 90 minutes per child. Then we, by factor analysis, we checked out of these 91 items and of some other items from the credit that was developed at Harvard more recently. This is a maternal report, it's not a test on the children. We select the most informative. So we select 15 items from the Bailey's and 7 from the credit and aggregate them. And then we apply this new test, this new scoring mechanism, if you wish, in the original sample. Then when we went back, we get a new sample and we estimate the score. And these are the 3 distributions that we get. One is the distribution on the entire Bailey's. One is the distribution in the first sample on the selected items, and the third is the distribution on the new sample, the same villages but a different number of households. And you can see that the distributions are very simple. When you compare in the baseline sample the extended and reduced measure, the correlation coefficient between the two is 0.96. So they effectively contain the same information. This is very important because when you go to the field in the developing countries, you might not have 90 minutes to collect 91 items from the Baileys. And so you can get the same type of information on a much reduced set of data. So that's for the existing measures. By the way, something similar can be done. We have done it for parental investment. We use the FCI, which is a standardized test with a large number of items, and try to identify more crucial and informative measures. Then we go out and try to do new measures. So here I will give some example. The first one is bargaining power within the couple. The second is beliefs about the return to parental investment, and then individual preference for different allocation of resources. So the bargaining power, this takes some work that we have done in the past. This is a paper in the EJ that I wrote with Ingvild and Pedro Carneiro and Alex Armand. Where we try to evaluate the effect on bargaining power of a conditional cash transfer program in Macedonia. So in Macedonia, with a sample of 100 villages, 50 the grant was given to the wives, and 50 was given to the 50 villages were given to the wives, and 50 villages into the household heads. So after the original data collections, the wives were called to an office, to a center, where we ran an incentivized experiments, which was roughly like this. Here are 100 dinars that we will give to your husband. How much are you willing to pay to have them pay to you? The actual questions, the actual implementation was a bit more complex than that, but effectively that's what we're trying to measure. And then we redo the exercise with the hypothetical. So this was real. Eventually, this 100 dinars, which in that sample is 2 days of work for this population. So it's not a negligible amount. And then we do it with a much larger stakes, but it's hypothetical. So we get a considerable amount of variability linked to several observables, including religion, for instance, ethnicity and the like. We find that the targeting the grant to the wives shifted considerably the willingness to pay, and therefore our interpretation of bargaining power. The idea here is that if a wife is willing to pay a fair amount to gain control of these 100 dinars, probably her position in the marriage is relatively weak. So in the Tanzania sample, we repeated a very similar experiment, except that now we do it not just with the wives, but also on the husbands. So these are the results that we get. Out of 6,600 Tanzania shillings, the wives were willing, on average, to sacrifice 2,720 to gain control of that amount. And the husband were only willing to. Oh, I should mention that there is also another result is there is a high correlation between the incentivized and the hypothetical experiment on larger stakes. So in the Tanzania sample, when we run the same thing with the husbands, they are willing to pay much less, and there is a substantial difference in the amount they're willing to pay relative to what the wives are willing to pay. And we think that reflects gives you quite a bit of information on the bargaining position within the marriage. Now, I'm not saying that this is the perfect measure, and indeed there's some recent, just last week I read a paper that is looking at this type of issues, experimenting with different measures, and so there is quite a bit of work to be done, but that's one way to go about it. The second thing is several studies is beliefs that we tried to measure. In a paper that I wrote with Flavio Cunha and Pam Jervis, who is a co-author again in this paper today. We developed an approach that was originally done by Flavio with the two co-authors to measure mothers' beliefs about the process of child development. Effectively, the strategy there, we present mothers with scenarios which differ in two ways. We say in initial condition and investment. And so we'd say, think of a child with these features and think of a mother that does this thing with this child. So what happens to this child in a year's time? And so we effectively then vary the scenarios, both in terms of initial conditions and in terms of investment. And so we try to reconstruct the production function that these mothers have by varying the arguments of the production function and mapping them into what they say the expected outcomes is. So we done it initially in this experiment in Colombia that we ran with Pam and Flavio. We've redone it in Tanzania, we now collected on a much larger scale in a longitudinal data set in India, in Orissa. We have slightly modified the methodology we originally used, and we have been exploring new dimensions of beliefs. In the case of India, the longitudinal dimension will allow us to study learning and beliefs formation. An important point of this is that we use the existing data and factor analysis to choose to formulate efficiently the scenarios we present to the mothers. We need to get measures that are salient to mothers and that we are confident that they relate to child development. And the same procedures, then we do it with the investment. For child development, we use language because we see that language is very important. When you do the factor analysis, the language indicators usually have a very high loading factors in the measurement system. And moreover, the field work that we do is indicative of the fact that mothers are they're aware of the language development of their children, and they relate that to child development. And so this approach allows us to estimate the rates of return to parental investment and effectively subjective production function to compare to actual production function. And then we can correlate actual parental investment and subjective expected returns. In the case of Tanzania, we look at both the language development and social-emotional development. I don't think anybody else has done it in terms of social-emotional development. And again, we randomize whether the beliefs questions are answered by the father or the mother. These are the results that we get. Here are the distribution of the investment returns with high initial condition and low initial condition for the whole sample, for the mother sample, for the father sample. Typically what we find, and this is true in Tanzania, but it was also true in Colombia, and it's also true in India, these parents seem to have much higher expected return to investment with low initial condition than high initial conditions. These are the means of the distribution, but you can see that the entire distribution for low initial condition is shifted to the right. And this seems to be a robust result, and a result that contradicts some of the evidence that we have on the actual production function. Mothers have typically higher expected returns to investment for low initial conditions than fathers, with significant sizable difference between this expected return, while there is no significant difference on the high initial conditions. We do a similar exercise with the returns to social, in terms of social emotional development. And again, we get similar set of results. I'm not showing that in the interest of time. The third new measures that we implemented in Tanzania is information on husband and wife preferences using stated preferences. We use the data allocation game to elicit data on parents' preferences. So respondents were asked to allocate an hypothetical amount across different commodities and across different household members. And here I have some references to some similar papers that have done this, including some papers we've done with Ingvild and Pam and Charlotte Ringdell in Tanzania, some other work. I should mention here, this is one of the papers that I cite explicitly in this approach is very, very similar to some exciting new work that this set of authors has been doing in the US with this implementation of strategic survey questions. This is a paper that's just come out in the JPE, and the approach is very similar. This is a quote from the paper. If we want to develop direct measures of preferences, we need to develop survey instruments that allow respondents to provide us with information that identifies preference parameters, not only in a language which they are very comfortable, but they can be mapped to structural parameter of interest. So it's a very, very similar approach, and this is a paper I very much like. So in our case, in the case of Tanzania, the respondents were asked to allocate an hypothetical amount represented by a pile of beans to different expenditure categories and different household members. So this is the questions that they were asked, and the 6 commodities were clothing, food, health, transportation, learning material such as books, notebooks, pens and pencil, and school expenditure. And then they're asked to allocate it to themselves, to their spouse, or to the children in the family. And again, we have the 3 different samples when the father answers, the mother answers, or both together. So this is the results we have from that allocation. So these are aggregating across all the commodities. When the mother decides, she allocates 26% to herself, 17% to the spouse, and 55% to the child. When the father decides, she allocates 25% to himself, 22% to the spouse, and 52% to the children. If you look at the difference, there is no difference to the amount they allocate to themselves. There is substantial difference that they allocate to the spouse or to the child. Mother seems to allocate much more to the child rather than their husband. Their husband allocates more to the spouse rather than the child. When you go, so these are the questions answered by the mother. These are questions answered by the father. In the 4th column, the questions are answered by the couple together. And what is remarkable here is that, and this is true in this table, but throughout, the couple decisions are very similar to the father answers. We again indicating who makes decision. You could interpret this. This reveals the UW, the utility function of the wife. This reveals UM, the utility function of the male. And this reveals the weighted of the 2 with pi and 1 minus pi. And if pi is the weight given to the wife, it seems that it's much lower than the weight given to the wives, which is also consistent with the bargaining power questions that I showed earlier. When you dig deeper in how they spend the money allocated to children, again, there is a difference in clothing and food. The mother seems to give more to their children, while the other items proportionally within the amount is quite similar. And again, the couple decisions seem much similar to the father's decision. Now, those are the new measures. So I gave you traditional measure of child development. I gave you measures of bargaining power. I gave you measure of beliefs, and I give you measure of preferences, if you want, for different commodities and individuals. Now, you might want to use these measures in a more structural way. So what I'm going to do next is to parameterize a simple model that I gave earlier on, and I use that to frame and interpret the data in a more systematic fashion. So we assume there are commodities consumed by wife and husband, the utility of W&H depends on the consumption of individual family members and child human capital. You start with the simple Douglas specifications, homothetic preference, which is this one. Now, it's not very realistic because it's homothetic, so the shares are going to be similar. And then you have a function for human capital production. You normalize all prices to 1, so you have that simple budget constraint, and you can assume either a unitary model, in which case all the alphas are the same, or you can have a collective model where the alphas are a weighted average of this of the husband and wife alphas, which is what this last bullet point says. So under homothetic preferences, individual allocation do not vary with income. So every life is particularly simple there. And that's the sort of equations you get. The only thing to notice here is that for when you go to investment, you get not just the preference for child development, but also the productivity of the investment. So parental investment depends on the beliefs about its returns. So we can estimate these parameters using exclusively the allocation data. Or you can relax homotheticity, and you can, for instance, if you use a pick-lock system such the almost ideal demand system, you get this type of expression, and then you go and complement the stated preference data with the refilled preferences of total expenditure that we have in our data set. So this is an example where you get close to combining the two data sets. When you go and interpret the way we do it, we interpret the answers provided by the wives as reflecting their own preferences, while the husbands reflected by their own preferences, and the one provided by the couples reflecting the collective or unitary preferences, which are those. And so using the husband and wife samples, we can test for difference in tastes. If you find that differences between estimated obtained with the individual sample and the couple samples are symptomatic of deviations from the unitary model. Now, these are two papers, recent papers I like very much, where they use a very rich data set from Malawi, both data set. And it's rich because it contains data on who consumes what within a household. So it's a remarkably rich data set, and yet these authors, Arthur Lubel, Krishna Pendakur, Valerie Leshen, and Duper are forced to make additional assumptions because they do not have static preferences data. While here, we can relax some of these assumptions. So these are some of the samples that we use. And again, I put in blue and red the things that are significantly different in the wife sample and in the husband sample. And again, this is symptomatic of systematic difference in tastes, and also deviation from the unitary model. Now, this is the work that we do with combining the two data set and assuming an homotheticity, but the results are not very different from the one in the previous table. Now, let me spend the last the last few minutes of my talk to discuss parental investment. So until now, especially in the homothetic case, I could use almost exclusively static preference data, the data that came from the allocation. If I want to deviate from authenticity, I need to complement it with the total expenditure. And they can be useful, can be informative. And some of the results I show, they are informative about difference in taste or difference allocation mechanisms. Now, next step is to use the preference information to model not only what we saw so far, but also parental investment. And as I mentioned before, parental investment in this model, it depends on total resources, depends on tastes, the alphas, depends on household perceptions of the process of child development, and depends on bargaining power. So what we do here, we first synthesize from the alphas in the previous table a factor which reflects parental preferences. And then we have a parental investment factor, and then we have relative preferences for children human capital, and bargaining power, and the beliefs about the productivity of investment. So I can put, if you wish, a reduced form of parental investment that depends on all these factors. They're typically not observable in a data set, and that's the way we construct it here. So when I get the whole sample, I can regress parental investment on preferences. So these are a factor that comes from the alphas, and you get, that it's got the right sign. The couples that have higher preferences for child human capital utility function seems to have a higher investment. We can augment that specification to get to beliefs, which has got, again, the right sign, but it's not particularly, it's not significantly different from zero. Now, this is for the whole sample. However, we just said that there might be some important deviations from the unitary model, and there might be important differences in preferences. So the next step is to do the exercise just on the couple sample. And so again, we run the specification on the couple sample, introducing just preferences. Again, it's got the right sign, it's much higher coefficient now. We augmented with the bargaining power of the wife. And again, it's got a very strong, significant, and positive impact, coherent with the fact that the wives seem to have a higher allocation, stated allocation. In the wife sample, this is a different sample. This is just a couple sample than the husbands. And the beliefs that it's not significant, but it's got the right sign. So those are the results that seem to indicate that parental investment, and these are actual measures of parental investment derived from standardized tests. This is the FCI data that is collected there. And we relate it to stated preferences and beliefs and bargaining power. So this goes towards constructing a coherent picture of this model. So the way we see this is the first step in utilizing these new measures within a new unifying framework that combines stated and revealed preferences. The next step will be on validating the new measures that we have constructed, both of child development and parental investment, but also these new measures of bargaining power and decision-making power and the like, and beliefs. And we are in the process of doing this in a variety of data sets in India. We'll go back to Tanzania again quite soon, so that will be happening. And then we want to use this information within a more structured model where we relate weights in the collective model and sharing rules and demand system. And the availability of these new measures, we think, will allow us to new ways of testing this model. I think we, or at least I've learned a huge amount from this process. It's been a very exciting research agenda, both about the theory and about measurement. And there is still much more that needs to be learned. In particular, the third bullet point here on the using the longitudinal data to model changes in beliefs and learning and the like is quite exciting. So let me conclude. I hope I convince you that measurement is very important, that what we can measure should be broad. We should not shy away, as many of us have done in the past, from measuring tastes, subjective expectations and information, beliefs, attitudes, and norms. I haven't talked about attitudes and norms, but it's very important. Analogously, information, the quality of networks and nature of networks, all these are very important things to measure. And the methods should be informed by the type of theoretical questions that we ask, and they should drive the type of measures that we construct. And I can conclude here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Orazio. I think you've given the audience plenty to think about. One unfortunate feature of the virtual meeting is that we have to finish exactly on time because otherwise we're going to be cut off. There are a few questions that unfortunately we don't have time to discuss, but I'm going to forward those to Orazio and perhaps they can be answered at a later point in time. Perhaps you can answer one very quick question, which is, there is demand for your PowerPoint presentation. Will you post it on your website or on the Econometric Society website?
I will post it both on the Econometric Society website and on my own website. All the slides will be available there.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks to all of you who connected. Once again, Happy New Year, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the Econometric Society meetings. Thank you very much, and thank you, Orazio.